Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss any update from Rouse IAS Study Circle. Join the only official Telegram channel of Rouse IAS Study Circle to get the relevant materials and important updates. Hello and welcome to the Daily News Simplified, the what, why and how of the newspaper reading. So today we shall take up the Indian Express Explained section of the last week and The Hindu from the last Sunday. The news to be discussed has been displayed on the screen and timestamping has been provided in the description section. So moving on to our first topic, the shift off radar, small arms and civilian targets. Now this topic has come in the context that recently our security agencies have identified that the militants are changing their methodologies. There has been a shift in the modus operandi of the militants in the areas of Jammu and Kashmir, and they have claimed that almost all the civilian killings have been carried out by newly recruited terrorists or those about to join the ranks using pistols. Under this topic, we will analyze that under which dimension of the syllabus does this topic exactly falls and what was the UPSC PYQ which can be related to this topic. And then we will analyze in detail the recent shifts in the militant strategy covering all the possible points and the ways to neutralize the threats emerging out of such scenario. So let us begin in detailed analysis. First we will look these syllabus highlights. So this topic falls directly under the paper of General Studies 3 under the subtopic of security, and from this very topic UPSC has asked a question in mains from 2019. The question was the banning of the Jamaat-e-Islami in Jammu and Kashmir brought into focus the role of overground workers. Now this technical word is very important because this word will also come in today's analysis. Overground workers in assisting the terrorist organizations. Examine the role played by OGWs in assisting the terrorist organization in insurgency affected areas and also discuss the measures to neutralize the influence of the OGWs. Now the point is, until and unless you are not aware about this word, that what exactly do you mean by overground workers, you will not be able to attempt this question in a better way. So under this topic, we will cover this dimension also along with the added dimensions which were there in news. So there are basically 5 dimensions which show that there have been a significant shifts in the modus operandi of the militants working in the areas of Jammu and Kashmir. The first is that nowadays they have begun to target the minority groups in the Jammu and Kashmir as well as the political leaders. So the point is that now the attacks on the civilians have increased. Now here you should analyze one important trend. That is that on one hand they are targeting the minorities, on the other hand they are targeting the political leaders of the ruling government. So in a way they are attempting to incite the feeling of communalism. That is how the internal security of India becomes very complex, that we are not just threatened by the foreign state actors or non-state actors, but their modus operandi is now focusing on disturbing the internal peace of our country by targeting the civilians, minorities and political leaders in order to incite the communal feelings in the society. The second important trend which security agencies have witnessed is that there has been a significant rise of the part-time militants. Now what are these part-time militants? There is also another term which is used in this context, that is the hybrid militants. Now what are these? Security agencies have found that in recent times the militants are not full-time like they used to be in earlier times. Recently there are people who are not designated as ultras, that is they do not come under the radar. So they are not designated as ultras by our security establishments, but on the other hand they are radicalized enough to carry on the strikes. And the larger issue remains is that once they have carried out their terrorist strikes, they get back to their routine life. That is why they are called a part-time militants or the hybrid militants, because they are not working full-time and they are not purely militants. They are hybrid of pure militants and civilians. But these hybrid elements have a huge potential to disturb of our security, law and order. The primary reason being that they are off radars and difficult to track. The third important thing is that there has been a significant rise in the usage of high technology weapons. For example, recently the attacks which were carried out in Jammu and Kashmir were done by the pistols which were being used by the youths, but these pistols were transported from the Pakistan side to India with the help of drones. Now you just imagine the lacunas and the drawbacks, the loopholes in our border management system, that we were not able to identify these drones, and these drones were used to transfer the pistols from Pakistan to India. The fourth important point is that there have been a frequent shift of organizations. Now what do we mean by this point? Earlier what happened was the militants were associated with single organizations throughout their lifetime, because every militant or every terror organization has its own modus operandi. They work in their own way. Their pattern of planting bombs is different and everything is different. So it was easy for our security establishments to identify that which attack was carried out by which organization. But recently it is witnessed that these part-time workers are not associated with any one organizations. They have attacked our area under a common name of Resistance Front, and many of the militants have been identified at one point of time with Hizbul Mujahideen, at other point of time they were identified with Lashkar-e-Taiba. So the point is that one person is associated with different organizations, and therefore the task of identifying those people becomes very difficult. And the last one is that the on-ground workers are assisting the militants and the terrorists in our country. Now what are these on-ground workers? On ground, as the name suggests, that there are certain people, certain workers which are working on ground and they are supporting the terrorists. Hence, these are those people who support the terrorists in terms of providing the logistics, infrastructure support, finances, shelter, etc. So in a way, these on-ground workers strengthen the militants and terror outfits and they carry out their strikes. Because without these things, the militant organization will not be able to attack our areas. But now the question is that how can we neutralize the threats emerging out of such scenario? Now the police officers have said that recent destructions of the support structure of militants along with the maintenance of law and order has led to frustrations among the militant outfits and has also led to new challenges. But we have to neutralize these threats. How can we do that? The first and the foremost thing is that the foreign funding should be stopped immediately. Because we all know that most of the militant and terror outfits in our country are funded by some foreign state actors as well as non-state actors, and there have been an issue of money laundering, round taping, hawalas. All these things have created a mess in financial security of our country, which in turn is breeding the militant organizations. So first of all, we need to crack down on foreign funding. For this, we can leverage a well-established institution, that is Financial Action Task Force. The second is, as we have analyzed in our topic, that there have been a transfer of pistols from Pakistani side to the Indian side across the borders with the help of drones. So it makes mandatory to have an effective border surveillance mechanism. The government had come up with a scheme, Comprehensive Integrated Border Management System, which aimed at electronic surveillance. So it should be strengthened and the work should be completed in no time so that we can ensure our border safety in a better way. The third important thing is community policing. Now this word is again very important. We all have witnessed that there is a certain trust gap, a communication deficit between the people and the police, and which is one of the major reasons behind the lack of proper law and order enforcement. So the researches suggest that the philosophy of community policing can be a very handy to tackle such situation and build the bridge between the people and the police. According to the philosophy of community policing, now what is community policing? According to this philosophy, the police personnel operate in same area, and because they are stationed in same area for a longer period of time, the police personnel as well as the people of that particular area come in contact with each other and they come to know each other in a better way. So this builds a trust between the police and the people, and the police personnel also comes to know the specific challenges, the specific issues of those very areas. So that is why, in order to strengthen the bridge between the people and the police, we need to adopt community policing, especially in those areas which are facing such challenges of insurgency and militancy. The fourth important step is the community leadership. In every areas, in every community, we have found that there are certain people who are highly revered and respected. So our administration, our security forces need to talk with them and convince them that they should come forward in order to encourage, motivate the youth, show them the right path. Under this, civil society organizations, self-help groups can also be leveraged to establish a community leadership, because the youths are more in touch with the community leaders rather than the administration or the security forces. And the last important thing is that we should also reform our police administration, and the first important step in that direction would be to increase the number of police personnel. You will be shocked to know that presently the police personnel ratio in India is just around 140 per lakh population, and the United Nations recommended figure is 222. So we are almost the half of what is required or what is desired as per the UN recommendations. So we can imagine that if we are not having enough police, how can we ensure the law and order situation of any country? So these are the issues and the ways ahead also to neutralize the threats emerging out of the recent shifts in strategy. So summing the entire topic once again, we saw the context of this topic in regard to the recent activities in Jammu and Kashmir, and then we analyzed the main questions which asked about the overground workers. So there might be a question on the hybrid militants as well. Then in detail we discussed the shift in the recent militant strategy and the ways to neutralize the threats emerging out of such scenarios. So moving on to our next topic, that why is a coal shortage choking the thermal power plants? So this topic was in news in the context you might have read that India's thermal power plants are facing a severe coal shortage, and the coal stocks have reduced to an average of 4 days of fuel across an increasing number of thermal stations. And in the wake of this situation, Union Power Minister R.K. Singh has said that while the supply crunch has not yet led to any power cuts in the country, but the coal supply situation is likely to be uncomfortable for up to 6 months. Now this becomes a difficult situation for India because, as you all know, that coal constitutes majority portion of the India's energy mix. So in this context, this topic was there in the news. So this is a brief overview of this topic. We'll discuss one UPSC previous year questions, the coal mines in India and the contribution of coal in the India's power sector. Next, we will cover the dimensions related with this topic, that what is the extent of the crisis, what are the reasons for the current crisis, the impacts of shortages, and the way ahead, what steps are being taken by the government. So let us begin with this topic. First, we will look at the syllabus highlights. This topic comes directly under the GS paper 3 in the subsection of economic development and the micro section of infrastructure, that is energy. So this topic is a direct part of our syllabus, And this topic is also relevant from India's socio-economic point of view, and that is why it is repeatedly asked in UPSC questions in prelims as well as mains. For example, a sample question from the prelims paper 2019 is taken. Now consider the following statements. The first is that coal sector was nationalized by the government of India under Indira Gandhi. The second is now the coal blocks are allocated on the lottery basis. And the third one is till recently, India imported coal to meet the shortages of domestic supply, but now India is self-sufficient in coal production. Now this is the beauty of the UPSC questions, that the major concept, the major issue, if you are aware about this in any topic, you will be able to solve the questions. Now this statement seems false because India is not self-sufficient in the coal production, and that is why we still are facing the shortages of domestic supply. So you just eliminate the third statement and you get the answer. Now if you consider the map of India and you closely notice that this is the portion where most of the coal mines are located. The coal producing areas in India are the eastern and the northeastern peninsula, the states of West Bengal, Jharkhand, Odisha, Chhattisgarh, Telangana, Andhra and some parts of Maharashtra. Though there are certain patches in Jammu and Kashmir, Himachal, Tamil Nadu also, but the majority of the coal in India comes from this area. And there are important coal mines in India also. For example, Jharia coal mine, Bokaro coal mine, Raniganj. So there are several coal mines in India as well. And now if you closely look in this data analysis, you will find that the major portion of our energy mix is determined by coal. The fossil fuels share around 61% of the total installed generation capacity of India, and the coal shares around 52% of the total generation capacity. Some data also mention it to be around 54%, but the basic idea is that it is surely greater than 50%. And for that matter, presently the contribution of the gas is just 6.5% and diesel is just 0.1%. So we can see that coal has significant contribution in installed power generation capacity. So a deficit of a coal is obviously dangerous for India's energy security. And we all know that for any country, if there is a shortage of energy, if there is an energy threat, that country can be crippled down to its needs. And that is why nowadays energy is also becoming important element of the geopolitical strategy in international relations. So this is a basic fact that India is the second largest importer, consumer and producer of the coal and has the world's fifth largest reserves. Despite this, it mainly imports the coal from the countries like Indonesia, Australia and South Africa, which means that despite having the fifth largest reserves and second largest producer of the coal, we still fall short of the coal. What are the reasons that the coal stocks have come down to an average 4 days of fuel in the India's thermal power station? First, we will look at what is the extent of the present crisis. The government recommends that the thermal power plants must hold 14 days worth of coal stock. That is the minimum amount, that for the 14 days the thermal power plants should have the coal with them. But on October 4, 16 thermal power plants had 0 days of coal stock, and additional 45 power plants had coal stock only for 2 days of generation. Now this was the extent of the crisis, that leave aside the number 14, 10, 8, we came down to the 0 days of coal stock with ourselves. Now we will look at what are the main reasons that we have come down to such a situation. The first was the natural reason that heavy September rains in the coal mining areas hit the production and delivery of the thermal power plants. But the second and the third, these two reasons are very much important from the human point of view, the human side's disruptions. It was witnessed that economy was recovering at a very huge rate in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has created a huge demand in the economy for the energy sector. And that is why the demand had outstripped the supply. So now we have two issues. First, we were not having the adequate supply because of the rains. And second, we are facing a huge jump in the demand in the economy, and which in turn has led to spike in the prices of the coal also. And from this topic, you can relate that this is not unique in India only. This phenomenon is experienced worldwide. That is why the prices of the coal across the globe has increased, and which has in turn led to the sharp fall in the imports of India, because the government has decided to lessen the imports and preserve its finances. So that is why basically there is a huge demand supply mismatch in the economy in the context of the coal, and this can have a huge deteriorating impact on our overall economy, because if industries face their electricity shortages, it could delay India's economic reopening. So we will in a way enter into a vicious cycle, because the reduced coal supply will impact the industries, which will impact the reduced production, and this will further enhance the reduced coal supply. So we need to break this vicious cycle of the coal demand supply mismatch in our economy. The second impact is that because of the present energy situation in India, some businesses might downscale the production. That is what we discussed in this vicious cycle. And the third is, we all know the huge population base which India holds. It is around 1.35 billion. And the underdeveloped energy infrastructure will mean that power crisis could hit long and hard. So the issue is that the present situation will not only have the short-term impacts on our economy, but it can also have a huge long-term impacts on India's socio-economic progress. So that is why government is taking few steps to have a sustainable way ahead. The first is that the state-run Coal India and NTPC are working to raise the output from the mines, because that is the only solution so as to match the demand in the economy. The second is that the government is trying to bring more mines on streams to boost supply. And the third suggestion is that India needs to amplify its imports despite the financial cost. Because if we are more focused on preserving our finances in the short run, as we discussed, it can have a huge long-term detrimental effects on economy. So that is why all these steps are in order to increase the supply of the coal in the short run. So summing up the entire topic in brief, we analyze the context because of which we are discussing the topic and the associated UPSC prelims question. Then we discuss the coal producing areas in India and few of the mines in the eastern and northeastern peninsular region. Then we analyze the data that coal contributes more than 50%, ranging from 52 to 55% in the total installed generation capacity. Then we had a close look towards some basic data of India's coal sector and the extent of the present crisis. We analyzed the reasons responsible for these crises and the impact of the shortages and what government can do in a short run to achieve a sustainable balance between the demand and supply of the coal. So our next topic is anti-defection law, which regularly and more often appears in newspaper from time to time. But this time this topic has come in the context of West Bengal Assembly. The context is that the Calcutta High Court has given West Bengal Assembly Speaker Biman Banerjee a deadline to pass an order in a defection case involving MLA Mukul Roy. Now these names are not important, but what important is that the issue of defection has once again reached to the higher judiciary, and judiciary has intervened by saying that there should be a deadline, because in the constitution there is no deadline being given to the speaker to decide upon the matters of disqualification. That is why the statement of High Court becomes really relevant in this context. So taking a brief overview of this topic, under this topic we will see that how much relevant this topic is from the examination point of view, because time to time there have been questions asked in prelims as well as mains. Then we will come on the adverse impacts of the defection politics on Indian democracy, and we will link it with the given constitutional provisions under the 10th schedule. Then we will move on to the important recommendations of the NCRWC and other committees which are there to reform the protest in order to curb the defection. And finally, we will also have a look on the Supreme Court observations and suggestions in this context. So let us begin our topic. So this topic falls under the General Studies paper 2, the part of Constitution directly. First, you should understand that what basically do we mean by anti-defection law. So you might have heard about this in news several times, that the legislators which were elected on the ticket of suppose party X, after election, after coming into house, they join the party Y. So this negatively impacts the stability of the government, and this is what is known as defection. So in order to curb the defection, anti-defection law was passed. Anti-defection law punishes the individual MPs or MLAs for leaving the party and joining the another party. This was inserted under the 10th schedule of the Constitution via 52nd Constitutional Amendment Act. And certain modifications were also made by 91st Constitutional Amendment Act. So this is the brief overview of what do we mean by anti-defection law. Now we will have a look on the prelims question asked in 2014. Which one of the following schedules of the Constitution of India contain provisions regarding anti-defection? Very simple question, straightforward question. But the question asked in mains require analysis. For example, in 2013, the question asked was that the role of individual MPs has diminished over the years, and as a result, healthy constructive debates on policy issues are not usually witnessed. How far can this be attributed to the anti-defection law, which was legislated but with a different intention? So the intention of the anti-defection law was to prevent the horse trading inside the house and to provide the stability to the government. But it is been observed that the law has curbed the freedom of speech of the legislators. How? We will discuss further. And then there was another indirect question in UPSC 2020 mains. So the question was, once a speaker, always a speaker. Do you think the practice should be adopted to impart objectivity to the office of Speaker of Lok Sabha? What could be its implications for the robust functioning of parliamentary business? So the question is talking about the objectivity to the Speaker of Lok Sabha, or for that matter in legislative assemblies also. Now this topic is also indirectly related with the context of anti-defection law. How? This also we will discuss in this session. Now first we will understand the adverse impacts of the defection politics on Indian democracy. The first and the foremost impact is that it undermines the electoral democracy, because we align ourselves to the principles of that very party and the person standing from the ticket of that party. But what happens is, when the electors enter into the legislative assemblies or the Lok Sabha, they join the hands with other political parties whom we have rejected in the election. So the point is that on our trust certain legislators were elected, but they have chosen some other parties in the house. So it undermines the electoral democracy by shifting the political allegiance mid-term, and defectors betray the electoral mandate. The second important thing is that it promotes horse trading. In news you must have heard about the rampant bribery and corruption during the horse trading processes in order to topple the elected government in the house. The next important point is that the greed overtakes the constitutional morality. Now what do we mean by constitutional morality? Now understand this in the following way. The constitution has broadly two parts. One is the literal part and other is the philosophical part, which is value based. So the constitutional morality says that you don't have to follow the constitution in only the literal spirit. That is, you don't have to restrict the constitutional interpretation in literal terms, but you should understand the philosophical basis of the constitution and you should uphold the values. And what are the important values of the constitution? For example, liberty, equality, rule of law, coordination between conflicting interests. So the idea is that you have to follow the constitution in letter and spirit as well. But it is observed that the legislators find the loopholes in the anti-defection law and they just follow the literal meaning of that law and they fail to uphold the values. That is why this horse trading and misusing of the anti-defection law goes against the constitutional morality. The next important thing is that it restricts the individual's political freedom and right to vote due to party whips. How? We'll see this with the article given in the Constitution. So the Constitution under this section, disqualification on the grounds of defection, says that if the legislator votes or abstains from voting in such house contrary to any direction issued by the political party to which he belongs or by any person or authority authorized by it in this behalf shall be disqualified for being a member of the House. Which means that whatever direction is given by the party whip to any legislator, that legislator is bound by that party whip. He cannot exercise his own freedom of speech, he cannot exercise his own intellect, because the party then can issue a whip against that legislator and he might lose his seat in the House. And the last important point is that the speaker acts in a partisan manner in cases of anti-defection and delay the processes. The constitution says under the part decisions on the questions as to disqualification on the ground of defection. If any question arises as to whether a member of a house has become subject to disqualification under this schedule, that is the 10th schedule, the question shall be referred for the decision of the chairman or, as the case may be, the speaker of such house, and his decision shall be final. Now this is also important point, because now the speaker has been made a final and sole authority to decide on the disqualifications. But the issue is that we all know that speakers themselves are not impartial because they belong to the ruling party in the Lok Sabha. Now, in order to rectify the prevailing situation, there have been important recommendations provided by several committees like National Committee to Review the Working of Constitution and Dinesh Goswami Committee. The first is, these committees say that amend the 10th schedule to ban all the kinds of defection, because presently you might have read that the law only forbids the individual defection but it allows the merger, that is the mass defection. The second important recommendation is that the defectors who have been disqualified on the grounds of anti-defection should contest fresh elections before joining the houses again. The third important thing is that the defectors should be debarred from holding the public office for the remaining term. The fourth point is that the vote to topple the government should be considered as invalid. Because if on every issue there is a party whip against the legislator, then the legislators will not be able to provide his own intellect. So that is why it is said that only on those issues which threaten the stability of the government, for example the no confidence motion or the money bills, only on those important situations the legislators should be bound by the party whip. On other matters, they should not be obligated to obey the party whip. And last important thing is that the speaker should not decide the matters of defection. And the Dinesh Goswami Committee and 170th Law Commission report has suggested that the questions of disqualification should vest in the Election Commission. In this regard, there are certain observations and suggestions by the Supreme Court also, and the most important case is Kesham Meghchandra Singh versus Union of India. So the Supreme Court observes that as per the Article 93, the Lok Sabha shall choose two members of the House to be respectively Speaker and Deputy Speaker. The Speaker is a constitutional authority and his tenure is dependent on the will of the majority. So likelihood of suspicion of bias could not be ruled out. Now this is said by the Supreme Court itself, as mostly the speaker belongs to the ruling majority. That is why the Supreme Court has cast certain apprehensions on the role of speaker. And in this regard, Supreme Court has given a suggestion to make a constitutional amendment and set up a permanent tribunal in case of speaker. Supreme Court has remarked that substitute the Speaker of the Lok Sabha and Legislative Assemblies with a permanent tribunal headed by a retired Supreme Court judge or a retired Chief Justice of a High Court to ensure that such disputes are decided both swiftly, that there should not be delay, and impartially, that is on the basis of objectivity and merit of the case. So summing up the entire topic in brief, we learned about adverse impacts of the defection politics on Indian democracy in context of the betrayal of the electoral mandate, the horse trading, bribery, corruption, and the instability of the government. Further, we also looked at what do we exactly mean by the constitutional morality and how the anti-defection law restricts the freedom and right to speech of the legislators. And finally, we analyzed that there have been instances where speakers have acted in partisan manner. and this we understood with the help of constitutional articles and provisions. Then we analyzed the important recommendations given by various committees to amend the 10th schedule and ban all kinds of defection, contesting the fresh elections and barring the legislators from holding the public office in case they are disqualified on the basis of defection. And further we analyzed two important points, that the invalid votes, that the case of defection against any legislator should be started only in case that he or she has voted against the whip in only those situations which were threatening the stability of the government. And we also understood that why speakers should not decide the matters of defection. And finally, we looked upon the important observations and suggestions given by Supreme Court in this case in context of the biasness associated with the speaker and the possibility of creating the permanent tribunal to deal with the matters of defection. Moving on to our next topic, the future proofing Langa Manganiyar heritage. Now this topic is very important from the culture point of view, and this topic was in news in the context that a new initiative is being taken to preserve the deteriorating culture of these communities. These communities are found in the Rajasthan areas and are very famous for their ballads, folklores and songs. Now the project is undergoing for the documentation and digitization in order to preserve this culture. And this project is started by the Archives and Research Center for Ethnomusicology at the American Institute of Indian Studies, which is in India, supported by an organization in Jodhpur called Rupayan Sansthan, which was established by eminent folklorist the late Komal Kothari and the writer Vijaydhan Detha. Under this topic, we will look into the UPSC previous year question which was asked in similar context. Then we will look into certain key facts about these communities and a basic difference between the Langas and the Manganiyars community. And finally, we will also discuss that what are the recent threats because of which this art is facing its death time. So this topic falls under the General Studies Paper 1 Indian Heritage and Culture part, as it is specifically mentioned in the syllabus that Indian culture will cover the salient aspects of art forms. So this topic comes directly under the micro topic of art forms. In 2014, UPSC asked one question on Changpa communities. In this question, try to analyze the mindset of the UPSC, that on which dimensions does UPSC ask its questions. With reference to the Changpa community of India, consider the following statements. First is related to the location of certain communities. The statement says that they live mainly in the state of Uttarakhand. The second is related to the occupation of that community. It says that they rear Pashmina goats that yield a fine wool. And the third is that they are kept in the category of the scheduled tribes from the polity point of view. Now this gives you a hint that on which dimensions you should read any particular topic. So for this, the answer is 2 and 3 because these are not found in Uttarakhand, rather in the state of J&K mainly and some parts of Himachal Pradesh. On similar lines, now we will discuss about the Langa communities and the Manganiyar communities. The first important fact is that the Langas and the Manganiyars are the hereditary communities of the Muslim musicians. That means that they might be having some closeness to the Sufi singing of the Muslim culture. So they are the hereditary communities of the Muslim musicians and are called important word which is musical cousins. In the past, both had enjoyed the royal patronage under various kings. Those kings were from the Hindus as well as Muslims backgrounds, and the prominent areas of their living is the western Rajasthan, the Thar desert area. That is why these are also called as desert tribes. So the western Rajasthan's Jaisalmer and Barmer areas, and also in certain areas of Pakistan's Sindh, because it is geographically adjoined to the western part of India. Moreover, in India, they are also found in certain parts of Gujarat as well as some patches of Punjab too. Now the music The music of these communities is very diverse and it comprises a wide range of heroic items, romantic tales, and the spiritual Sufi stories also. So it is a complete blend, complete mixture of heroism, romanticism, and spiritualism. And again, the last point also reflects the diversity, the literary diversity of this tradition, because the performances are in multiple languages. It is not restricted only to the local language of Sindhi or major language of Rajasthani. No, it includes various languages and dialects, including the Marwadi, Sindhi, Saraiki, Dhatti, and Thareli. But now there are certain differences also because they are musical cousins. So that means that there will be some similarity, but because these are cousins, so there will be some dissimilarities also. Now we will analyze that what are the major differences between the Langas and the Manganyar communities. The first, yes, we discussed that both the communities were patronized by the royal kings in the past, but the major patrons of the Langas were Muslims and the major patrons of the Manganyars were the Hindus, the Rajput kings. The second is related to the instrument. The major instrument of the Langas are Sindhi, Sarangi, and Algozas. But for the Manganyars, it is Kamaicha. Now both the instruments are stringed instruments. And the last and very important difference is that the Langa musicians were mainly related to the Sufi music. On the other hand, the Manganyars musicians invoke Hindu god Krishna. Both of these communities has a common past that they were from the Muslim communities, as we have discussed here. But an important difference also emerges that one were related to the Sufi music and the others were related to the Hindu god Krishna. Now this again shows the unity and diversity of our rich heritage and culture. But the recent studies and researchers have also pointed towards the threats to this art. The first is that the COVID-19 pandemic, which has crushed the economy, which has blocked the human movement, it has also stopped the performances of these arts in India as well as abroad, and this is posing a huge challenge for the survival of their artists. The second is that, as we have discussed that earlier there was a royal patronage, but nowadays the system of patronage is not there, which again is hugely impacting the survival potential of these communities. And the last one is the rise in urbanization. Understand the rise of urbanization in the cultural context. Now we do not much differentiate between the differences of modernization and westernization. We do not pay the required respect towards our ancient or our folk dances or musics or songs, etc. Because in the wave of urbanization, we are not just moving away from the green lands, we are also moving away from our cultural lands. And this homogenization in terms of music, dance, food, choices, thoughts, etc. is killing our rich ancient culture. So rise in urbanization have forced the youth to move towards the rising, for example, the pop culture in music. And we are dissociating ourselves from the rich heritage, the rich folk culture of our country, for example, the Langas and the Manganyars music. So summing up this brief topic again, first we looked at the context which was there in the news, and then we discussed the UPSC questions which was asked on similar lines, on similar context. Then we discussed in detail about the key facts which can be asked in the prelims paper, the areas to which they belong, the languages, their main themes, an important term, the musical cousins in this context, and we also discussed some of the important differences between these two communities despite both being the cousins. And finally, we analyzed the recent threats because of which the artists of Langas and Manganyar communities are facing threats. So now is the time for the question of the day. The question asked yesterday was, with respect to the RBI's government securities acquisition program, consider the following statements. The GSAP is mainly used for controlling the yield rates of government securities. Yes, this statement is correct. The GSAP involves both buying and selling. No, this statement is incorrect because it deals only with the buying and not with the selling. So this statement is incorrect. The question asked is that which of the statements given above is or are correct. So option A is the correct answer. And the question for today is the Langa Manganyar committees belong to which states? A. Rajasthan, B. Uttar Pradesh, C. Karnataka or D. Telangana.